Tane nane nane no. Tane nane nane ne no. Ye le 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 lo.
The political history of the Attingal Revolt of 1721. It was during the times of the auspicious Vishu festival of 1721. The first anti-imperialistic, anti-colonial, anti-exploitational, anti-English, anti-foreign invasional revolt occurred in the precincts of the Attingal Koikal Palace, the abode of the Queen of Attingal in the ancient Indian kingdom of Venad, a princely state in South Kerala of the present day. The Queen of Attingal enjoyed sovereignty in her domain, bearing the title Mootha Tamburan. The chief of Attingal Fort, Captain Gifford and his squad, reached Koikal Palace, the abode of the Queen, situated on the shores of Vamanapuram river, Attingal, known by the name Koikal Kadavu, or the ferry point, in large country canoes, with a show of military glory, grandeur and power, to present the Queen the annual tributes and gifts, which were discontinued for long due to the conflict existed between them regarding the payment of taxes in their trade of spices. The Koikal Palace remains the monument of the historical event of 1721 in Attingal, a small town 30 kilometers north of Thiruvananthapuram, the capital of Kerala at present. NH 66 passes crossing this town, and the historic location of the palace is connected by the Palace Road starting from the East Junction Attingal. The palace is a protected area under the Department of Archaeology, Government of Kerala, considering its national importance. The ancient Attingal was a principality which had the independent domain status in Venad, and the Queen's eldest son was the heir to the crown of Venad, as the princely state Venad followed matrilineal hierarchy of descent from Koikal Palace Attingal. Attingal existed with Mudakal in the east, Anjango in the west, Idakkodu in the south, and Idava in the north as its boundaries. As early as the times of Ayyan Adigal Thiru Adigal of 9th century, one of the earliest rulers of Venad with the capital in Kollam, whose reputation remains in history for Koilon Syrian copper plates, attempted to strengthen foreign trade which already existed in Venad long before his times. Accordingly, Kollam and Vizhinjam ports assumed greater prominence during his reign. With the arrival of the Portuguese in the 15th century, followed by the Dutch and the English in the 17th century, stiff competition arose in the trade of spices. The foreigners competed one another to secure the monopoly for pepper trade. There was a small seaport named Ilankoras in Attingal domain, renamed as Anjango with the arrival of the Portuguese, the Dutch and the English in the later years. It was a prominent seaport and an ancient trade point even from the times of Ptolemy, born in AD 100. The Portuguese established their settlements in this area by the middle of the 16th century. It was in 1519 when the Queen of Attingal ruled Deshinganad also. The permission to construct a fort in Tangacheri, known as Thomas Fort, was granted to the Portuguese. In 1658, the Dutch captured the Portuguese fort in Kollam, followed by the Dutch military action of 1661 in Kollam and the Battle of Kochi in 1663 fought against the Portuguese, leading to their defeat and establishment of Dutch dominance in spices trade in Kochi and Kollam. In 1662, Makairam Tirunal, the elder sister of Ashwati Tirunal Umayamma Rani, became the senior queen of Attingal. In 1664, the Dutch director of spices trade, Nieuwhof, visited the senior queen of Koikel Palace, Attingal. The senior queen granted the Dutch the sanction for procurement of pepper in the domain and the establishment of a processing factory at Attingal. With the Portuguese having been conquered, there was no rival for the Dutch in their trade other than the English, who did not start trade in Bernard till then. Hence, the junior queen had a difference of opinion with the senior queen in her policies, as the junior queen felt that competition among the foreign traders was required in the domain for effective bargain, not only to collect higher rates of the taxes, but also bribes from the foreigners for the issue of sanction orders for pepper trade, which could be added to their private wealth. In 1677, Umayamma Maharani became the regent queen of Bernard. In 1678, with the demise of Makairam Tirunal, when Umayamma Rani became the senior queen of Attingal, she wrote a letter to the English stationed in Kozhikode, inviting them for trade of spices in Attingal, but the Dutch blocked their entry. In 1684, the governor of English East India Company, John Child, gave instruction to procure as much quantity of pepper as possible from Umayamma Rani's domain. But the Dutch warned the English against the attempt. In 1687, when the administration of the English East India Company was shifted from Surat to Bombay, Thomas Mitchell, the chief of the English East India Company Kozhikode, was instructed from Bombay to procure pepper from Bernard, and he was able to purchase 6,72,000 pounds of pepper, which exceeded the target fixed for Umayamma Rani's princely estate. T.P. Shankarankutti Nayar observes, Umayamma Rani, the head of the confederacy of semi-independent domains such as Travancore, Nedumangad, Kottarakara, Kollam, Karunagapalli, and Kayankulam, faced political and administrative problems and was in need of resources. It is recorded in history that from 1693 onwards, the British were in possession of a factory at Vizhinjam, a location sold to them by the regent queen Umayamma Rani of Bernard. Though the British wanted to fortify it, the Nair chieftains and the knights of the queen were opposed to the idea of fortification by a foreign company. It was these knights and the Nairs who managed the administrative affairs of the state. In due course, John Braban was sent to the queen in Koikel Palace, Attingal, to have talks and negotiations with her ministers and knights for constructing an English fort, at least somewhere else in her domain. The queen and some of her Nair chieftains received huge amounts of money, and one of her ministers of Attingal Palace, Kudaman Kochumadevan Pillai, took initiative. The final location for the fort, founded by him in Attingal, was approved by Braban. On 29 June 1694, sanction order was issued to the English for the monopoly of pepper trade and for the construction of a factory and fort in Attingal, which was in her independent domain of Attingal, against the interest of the Nair chieftains and knights who managed the affairs of Bernard. Hence, to a certain extent, the Queen's decision was unquestionable by them. Umema Rani's order was against the interests of the Dutch, who established a factory in Anjango during the reign of Kartika Tirunal in the domain of Attingal. The Dutch instructed the native tradesmen of the inevitable slash of prices of pepper in the market once there is monopoly and no competition between the buyers. When the English set up their factory in Anjango, under the instigation and support of the Dutch, the factory was attacked by these tradesmen and their stock was plundered. These tradesmen belonged to the various regions of the domain, irrespective of communal or religious differences. In 1695, the Queen compensated for the damages incurred to the English company. This incident compelled the British to construct a very strong fort in Anjango with cannons installed and armories attached for their protection. The fort is still protected in Anjango as a historical monument by the Department of Archaeology. Brabant, the first chief of Anjango fort, returned in 1707. Simon Cowsey was the chief of Anjango fort from 1707 to 1712. Later, John Kyffin took charge as the head of Anjango fort in 1712, but dismissed in 1719 due to his overindulgence in private trade. Captain Gifford succeeded Kyffin as the chief of Anjango fort. It can be observed that no English gentleman after Brabant volunteered to take charge of Anjango fort, situated far away from their native land. Hence, all those who took up the assignment in the fort had a criminal background and were with intention to amass wealth, resorting to unholy and wicked practices. The fortification of Anjango with arms and ammunition by the English was opposed by both the ministers of the Queen in Koikal Palace, Attingal, Kudaman Pillai and Vanchimuttat Pillai, though both were rivals to each other. When the construction of the fort was nearing completion, the cruelties, betrayal, public insult, and exploitation of the English over the non-Christian tradesmen, their agents, and natives gradually increased. Incidents such as compelling a Brahmin to shave an untouchable slave in the fort, leading to the excommunication of the Brahmin by his community. The official interpreter and linguist of the settlement, Ignacio Malheiro, compelling the young boys in the fort to pelt rotten eggs on Muslim traders, etc., were the kinds of ill treatment faced by the non-Christian merchants from the European Christian merchants. This is the communal aspect behind the revolt to be understood together with various other aspects. The Muslim leadership had taken decision to strike hard at the English Christians at the earliest opportunity. The friends of the excommunicated Brahmin had also taken an oath to avenge the inhuman treatment of the Brahmin in a Hindu communal social order which observed the practice of untouchability. The traders were compelled to sell pepper at the rates fixed by the British, and on many occasions the accounts were manipulated, leading to exploitation and betrayal. By July 27, 1694, Anjango became a full settlement and they hoisted their flag, Union Jack, in the fort. When the fort was nearing completion of construction, it covered a square-shaped area of 78 square meters with 4 bastions, each of which mounted 8 18-pounder guns. The walls were very high and were of 6 feet width. The walls between the bastions hosted 7 or 8 cannons. In addition, there was a battery of some 20, 18 and 24-pounder guns facing the sea. The turrets were sufficient to hold 60 to 70 cannons, and they were fixed facing the other 3 directions, some focusing the Dutch settlements and some others the Koikel Palace. Around 120 Portuguese soldiers were also camped in the fort. The fortification frightened both the Dutch and the Queen. The Queen feared once the fortification was complete, the English would turn against her and pay no tributes or tax. The Queen gave orders to stop construction and block the conveyance of building materials to the fort. The English did not pay any heed to the order and brought the supplies by ship from other places to proceed with their plan. Attempts for negotiations also failed because Vanchimutat Pillai informed the English all secrets as the Queen took to her confidence Kudaman Pillai. In 1697, the Queen Umayamma Rani sent the Nair Brigade and the Muslims to occupy the fort under the indirect leadership of Kudaman Pillai. But the action ended in failure. The earlier attempts of the traders and the countrymen to attack the armory attached to the fort also could not succeed. The English had an upper hand in defense as they were in possession of modern weapons. In either case, the besiegers had to face severe casualties. After the Queen's military action and its failure, a big rift was created between the fort and the Koikel Palace, the 2 power centers in the domain. The taxes and yearly gifts fell due as the English avoided all meetings with the Queen. The situation was becoming charged and the people's bitterness with the English was becoming intense. The angry mob of the locality not only refused to trade with the English, but also put ablaze the British storehouse at Vettur, Varkala. This act infuriated the English and turned the situation worse. In 1698, Umayamma Maharani passed away. In 1699, the construction of the fort was completed. It is understood that Umayamma Maharani was succeeded by Kartika Tirunal Umadevi Tamburati, adopted from Kolathanadu as the senior queen of Attingal. This observation supports the fact that in 1706, when a son was born to her named Aniram Tirunal Marthandavarma, she ruled the domain as the senior queen. She was not efficient and experienced as Umayamma Rani in administration. Hence the ministers and the knights wielded all her power in the administration of her domain. After the Vettur incident, the English in the fort tried to take vengeance upon the natives. Friction prevailed in the domain. The spices trade in Attingal and Anjago came to a standstill. The natives, traders and their agents were antagonistic and refused to trade with the English. The Nair Brigade and the Muslim leadership waited for an opportunity to strike back upon the English. In January 1721, 300 English soldiers were deployed in the domain by English East India Company under the command of Walter Brown to suppress the riot and restore normalcy. They conducted a route march bearing firearms to bring the situation under control. The action brought the awareness of self-limitations among the Nair Brigade, native traders, Muslim leadership, the Queen, ministers and her knights, and the common people in general. This feeling resulted in restoring a seeming peace in the domain. On February 26, 1721, a few Nair pepper merchants met Captain Gifford and Malhero, but they were ill-treated and molested, which added fuel to their antagonism against the English. There was also another incident of Gifford and his wife, Catherine, pouring filthy water on Muslims who passed by the side of the fort, which intensified people's bitterness against the English. The decline in trade was viewed seriously by the English East India Company administration in Bombay, and Gifford was instructed to ease the situation and resume normal trade. It was at this juncture Kudaman Kochumadevan Pillai expired. He was succeeded by his young and able nephew. Captain Gifford bribed the minister Vanchimutat Pillai to find a way out from the crisis. Vanchimutam, a partisan of the King of Kollam, otherwise known as Deshingadad, managed to crown the king's sister as the Queen of Attingal. It can be inferred that there was financial problems in the domain due to shortage in revenue collection in the troubled political situation. The ministers and the knights who wielded high power in the new administration also wanted to bring in a compromise with the English to collect all the arrears of taxes and gifts due. They decided to implement the strategy of sending Vanchimutat Pillai for talks with Gifford. In an interview for the Hindu newspaper with Vasudevan Poti, the priest of the Queen's tutelary deity in Thiruvarattukavu temple, Attingal, in 2001, Poti observed that the name of the Queen was Rani Lakshmi Bai. Though the authenticity of the statement cannot be ascertained, the diplomatic mission entrusted to Vanchimutam in the new administration of the domain attained success. Finally, it was agreed to renew the English sanction for the monopoly of pepper trade and storage and settle all disputes existed between the tradesmen and their agents with them. Gifford became happy and agreed to visit the new queen and pay the arrears of taxes and gifts for the previous 7 years, though it was discontinued for 24 years from around 1697. But the promised visit was indefinitely delayed. It can be concluded that the Queen and her ministers expected the visit at least on the auspicious day of the Vishu, which also did not happen. This gave the young Kudaman Pillai an opportunity to visit the fort under the pretense that he was sent by the Queen to collect the gifts on her behalf. Actually, his intention was to collect the details of the possible date of their visit, survey the nature of weapons equipped in the fort, and to make an evaluation of the strength of soldiers deployed in the fort. Gifford and his allies were suspicious of the honesty of the minister as they envoyed the king to collect the gifts. Hence he was informed that Gifford and his men will visit the palace soon
and the gifts will be presented to the queen by Gifford in person. This information must have helped the young Kudaman Pillai, who indirectly organized the revolt of 1721, to make preparations for the assault. On 14th April 1721, Captain Gifford and his allies started for the Koikal Palace at Attingal from Anjango in large country canoes with all the pomp and glory of military grandeur and power, with the accompaniment of all the British soldiers in the fort, except for 4 who were left on the house duty to take care of the women, the children, the sick, and the pensioners left in the fort. These 4 were Robert Sewell, Lieutenant Peter Lapton, Ensign Thomas Davis, and Gunner Samuel Innes. As per information in Life and Loves of Catherine Cook in Kerala, where we get the biographic details of Gifford's wife. Gifford was accompanied by 120 merchants and 30 slaves. Malhero and Gifford led the march. They were received at the ferry point or Koikal Kadavar on the bank of Vamanapuram river, where the Koikal Palace was situated, by an enthusiastic crowd carrying arms. It was customary that the Nayars in service of the palace always carried arms. The delegation brought with them the arrear tribute of 7 years and presents to the queen and Pillais. That is about 17,000 panams per year, besides velvet and Venetian clothes, Burton, Fleming, etc. According to one version, the soldiers were compelled to disarm themselves due to security reasons before they entered the palace, and the weapons were handed over to the slaves to be carried back to the canoes. According to another version, after long discussions about the amount payable to each Pillai, and after finishing transactions, the Nayars disarmed the Englishmen for dinner and collected their arms. According to the former version, the soldiers moved out of the palace for their return voyage by dusk. But in the latter version, the Englishmen were compelled to spend the night in the palace premises in small batches. When Gifford suspected some foul play in the mob behavior, he sent a note to his assistant Sewell through a coolie, which read as follows: Captain Sewell, we are treacherously dealt with here. Therefore, keep a very good lookout of any designs on you. Have a good look to your 2 trankers. We hope to be with you tonight. Take care and don't frighten the women. We are in no great danger. Give the bearer a check-in. It is evident that the captain decided to move back and not to stay in the palace premises in small batches that night. The unarmed soldiers were moving to the Koikal ferry point where the canoes were stationed. The native armed tradesmen and their agents, mostly Muslims, the Nayar brigade, and the men folk belonging to the various localities in the domain, consisting of people from all religious sects, organized under the indirect leadership of the young knight Kudaman Pillai, as part of a master plan, pounced upon the soldiers and butchered them in cold blood. 133 British soldiers, including Captain Gifford and Malhero, met with their tragic end. Their wounded bodies were thrown into the Vamanapuram river Gifford's tongue was plucked out, his body cut into pieces, and nailed to a plank of wood, which floated in the waters like a rudderless skeleton boat. The other leaders of the fort, Malhero and Fleming, were also killed and their body cut into pieces and thrown into the river. The waters of the river turned blood red. This part of the Vamanapuram river came to be known as Kollumpuzha, meaning the river that kills. It is still known as Kollampuzha. The Koikal Kadavu, or the ferry point, came to be known as Kollampuzha Kadavu. The upheaval of 1721 was the culmination of a series of conflicts and revolts against the British supremacy, cruelty, and exploitation of the natives, already explained in this discourse. It is crossing the landmark of 3 centuries at present. Immediately after the bloodshed, the enthusiastic revolutionaries rushed to Attingal fort. It was about 6 kilometers southwest of Koikal Palace. The gunner Samuel Innes opened cannon fire to prevent them from occupying the fort. Though they were shattered, they put ablaze the houses of about 150 people who were informers and supporters of the English. They sought refuge inside the fort. The revolutionaries had to face severe casualty in the fire. On the very next day, that is the 15th of April 1721, 3 English women and 6 children, Gifford's wife Catherine Cook, Mrs. Cowse and 4 children, and Mrs. Barton and 2 children, were sent to Madras in a cargo ship named Prosperous, which had then delivered its cargo of cowries from Maldives and destined for Ceylon. There is no mention about Catherine's child, but she carried all the records she could get hold of in that exigency, and money she could lay her hands on. Henceforth, the revolutionaries, with the support of the natives, created blockade for transporting food and essential commodities to the fort. The king of Desinganad offered sanctuary. 150 women and children belonging to the displaced local people who sought refuge in the fort were sent to his care. To defeat the siege, on 25th April 1721, 2 small English ships from Cochin brought the essential supplies and 7 reinforcements. 35 were in siege, mostly pensioners and boys, of whom only 20 were able to use firearms. On 1st May, a small squad of 51 soldiers reached Attingal from Tellicherry. It was hard times for the English East India Company to fill up the shortage of soldiers caused due to the massacre. There was a rumor that the King of Bernard was sending a relieving force to the fort. On 24th June 1721, the protesters launched a heavy attack on the fort from all the 3 sides, making use of the firearms seized from Gifford soldiers. The gunner Samuel Innes' leadership was what saved the fort once again. The assault did not bring any fatalities in the garrison as per records, but their use of artillery and grenades brought severe casualties on the revolutionary side. The siege and intermittent attacks on the fort continued for the next 6 months, but no serious damages incurred to the fort. The King of Bernard blamed the Queen for maladministration. In Dutch records also, the blame is cast on the Queen. In return, the Queen blamed Kudaman Pillai, who managed the whole affair. The Queen went back to Kollam, promising not to return to Attingal until order was restored. She never came back. The fort received reinforcements from Calicut. The legitimate queen, who was restored, and her loyal subjects also sent supplies. In July, monsoon started, and hence no immediate attempts to relieve the fort was taken up from English East India Company administration, Bombay. On 17th October 1721, Mitford, the new chief for Anjango fort, arrived from Madras with 300 soldiers from Kavar and Surat. It was he who suppressed the besiegers and saved the fort from the siege. After the suppression of the revolutionaries, not only their supporters, but the suspects, including women and children, were taken captives and subjected to severe interrogation and physical and mental torture. Many of them had to tolerate persecution and sexual harassment. Some were detained in the fort, where their law was in force. Severe punishments, including capital punishment, inflicted according to their justice, were unquestioned by anyone from the palace. From the information collected from Parukuti Madhavan, a native of Anjango Panchayat, who died at the age of 72 in 1989, dead bodies of certain people taken for interrogation inside the fort were seen by the fishermen floating in the outer sea, as per oral information passed secretly those days. The Queen gave a compensation for the damages incurred to the British side. Mitford, who was more dishonest than his ancestors, was dismissed from service. Dr. Alexander Ohm, a surgeon by profession, who succeeded Mitford, was a friend of Waynard and a good diplomat. Unni Kerala Varma, the king of Waynard, strived to restore peaceful relations with the English during those times. On 25th April 1723, on behalf of the king of Waynard, the Prince of Iranial Palace, Anidam Tirunal Marthanda Varma, signed a pact with Alexander Ohm, permitting the English establish factories anywhere in Waynard as they desire, and a mint in Kulachal. It also empowered them the liberty shifted to Anjango in case of any inconvenience or exigency. The cruelties and exploitation of the British soldiers in Anjango upon the natives continued until the English East India Company abolished the commercial residency in Anjango and handed over the responsibility to their political agent or resident of Travancore in 1810. When Kartika Tirunal Umadevi Tampurati passed away in 1727, her sister Purittadi Tirunal became the senior queen. She was the sister of the king of Waynard, ruled between 1724 and 1729, named Rama Varma, and the younger sister of Kartika Tirunal. She was the stepmother of Marthanda Varma, the prince of Iranial, who was then 21 years old. Purittadi Tirunal was brought to suppress the Pillais and Knights of Attingal. With the support of Marthanda Varma, the queen decided to rule Attingal independently without the assistance of Pillais and Knights. But the Pillais and Knights of Attingal, under the leadership of Vanchimuttat Pillai, crowned one of the princesses belonging to Kayamkulam Principality as the Queen of Attingal. Purittadi Tirunal proceeded to Koikal Palace, Attingal, with the forces led by Ravi Varma, the husband of the junior queen, and confronted the Nair forces. In the fight, Ravi Varma was killed. The queen jumped out of the chariot with unsheathed sword in her hands. Due to the interference of the crowd of people of Attingal, the queen was prevented from the Nairs' attack. They surrounded and protected the queen. Marthanda Varma, who was only 21 years then, was sent with forces by the king of Waynard to protect the queen. Hence she was restored as the Queen of Attingal. His attempts to suppress the Pillais and Knights who led the revolt of 1721 began from this point. When Aniram Tirunal Marthandavarma succeeded Ramavarma from 1729 to 1758, more agreements with the English came into force. The agreement of 5th April 1729 ensured the English of Anjango the monopoly for pepper trade in Travancore, and another agreement of 15th December 1735 granted Vizhinjam to the English as recorded by William Logan in Malabar Manual. As early as 1729, he eliminated all the Pillais and Knights of Attingal. Those indulged in 1721 revolt were handed over to the British in the Anjango fort. Others were hanged to death. Their families were disintegrated and their wealth confiscated. Attingal domain was merged to Travancore in 1737, and the title of the head of Tripapur was got transferred from the senior kin, favoring Marthandavarma, the king of Travancore. Thereafter, the title of the Queen of Attingal existed only for namesake, for performing certain customs and temple ceremonies in Thiruvarattukkavu temple, the seat of the tutelary deity of the queen. Vanchi Muttathu Pillai, who escaped to Kayamkulam, led an army in 1739 with the support of Kayamkulam Principality with Marthanda Pillai and Krishna Nannavi as commanders. Earlier, they were the commanders of Marthandavarma's army in Attingal. With the strong support of the Dutch army, Deshinganad or Kollam also joined the invasion. When the army camped in Avanavancheri, Marthandavarma sought the British military assistance from Anjango. And Veeralam Venkota Velkota was fortified with their cannons and deployment of English forces. Though the defense continued for almost 4 months, in the final attack that happened in Veeralam, the enemies, including the Dutch army, were completely defeated in the cannon fire. This was the earliest victory of Marthandavarma, which led to his triumphant march to conquer many of the principalities among the 44 principalities which existed after the disintegration of the Second Chera kingdom. He not only conquered some of these principalities, but also consolidated them to form the unified Travancore state. It is significant that the 3 agreements executed by Marthandavarma with the English in Anjango fort referred to in this discourse brought a huge political gain to Marthandavarma by gaining the military support from the fort, not only in defeating the neighboring principalities and unifying Travancore, but also in defending a number of other attempts against the invasion of Travancore. The controlled autonomy under the British presidency, which the Travancore kings enjoyed during the dark period of the British Raj in India in the successive years, can also be attributed to the policies and diplomacy that the Travancore rulers maintained with the British in the successive years in continuation of these agreements. To sum up, the Attingal Revolt of 1721 was the earliest mutiny in India against the British occupation, colonization, and exploitation, which was fought 136 years before the first war of independence called Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, and 36 years before the Battle of Plassey of 1757. 133 Englishmen were killed in the Attingal Revolt, which occurred 300 years ago from the present. The magnitude of this struggle of 1721 will be understood when we realize that Only 29 Englishmen were killed in the Battle of Plassey of 1757. Unfortunately, the Indian historians have not given much focus on this upheaval, which was an outcome of the realization of the consequences of foreign invasion, colonization, exploitation, imperialism, and British dominance in an agrarian society in the Principality of Attingal. The class consciousness and class struggle, which is an inevitable part of such a realization, is the theoretical reason behind the revolt, though at the peripheral level, many other forces at work can be identified, such as anti-British, anti-Christian, anti-foreign invasional sentiments. In John Wilson's India Conquered, we get the perspective of the Englishman in the Anjango Fort in conquering or defending the attack and the siege of the fort by the Nair Brigade, Muslim tradesmen and the natives. He perceives in the book how the Englishmen resisted or fought against the Indians' attack with limited forces and modern arms within the fort when 133 English soldiers, including Captain Gifford, were assassinated and only 4 soldiers were left to the house duty of Anjango Fort. Out of the 35 in siege in the fort, only 20 knew how to use firearms. Hence the English perception on how they resisted the attack and the siege organized by the natives is recorded as Anjango War or Anjango Resistance. But the celebrated Kerala historians like Professor A. Sridhara Menon and K.P. Padmanabha Menon, who viewed the upheaval from an Indian perspective, called it Attingal Revolt, as people from all localities of the domain were involved in the struggle. Moreover, the actual fight causing the casualty of 133 Englishmen occurred in the precincts of Koikal Palace, Attingal. Anjango was a part of the domain Attingal, but once the English completed their settlement there with the permission of the Queen of Attingal and hoisted the British flag, Union Jack, it began to function as a parallel power center with the Koikal Palace, Attingal.
Unfortunately, an unwanted controversy is being invited on the question whether it should be called Attingal Revolt or Anjango War or Anjango Resistance. Both the titles focus the same incident, one from the Indian perspective and the other from the British perspective, in a context where two power centers and a conflict related to them existed in the past. So the present controversy is based on provincial interests. Such interests will belittle the national importance of the struggle, which was the earliest upheaval against the British tyranny in India. Hence, the right perspective is to view the incident from an Indian point of view and strive for the recognition of the historic struggle as the earliest freedom struggle, which has been untold so far.
Tane nane nane no, tane nane nane ni ni no, ye le 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 le.